Margaret Foster was 23 years old and had not slept beneath a roof she could truly call her own for 5 long winters. She had no family that would claim her, no inheritance set aside in her name, no household waiting to welcome her back, only a small tin box that had belonged to her grandmother and 2 copper pennies she had pressed warm inside her woolen glove all the way from the market square. And with those 2 pennies, tuppence, the price of a loaf and a smear of dripping at the stalls in Foxton, she bought a long-abandoned stone cottage on the edge of a neglected country estate, its heavy oak door swollen shut in its frame, its slates greened over with lichen and moss, its little garden gone entirely to nettle and briar and the pale trailing bindweed that swallows anything left too long alone. She had walked past the place twice, 3 times, before she had dared to ask about it. She had counted the chimneys and measured the windows with her eyes, and she had calculated in her head how many pails of water it would take to scrub one room clean, and she had gone at last to the solicitor's office in the village with her 2 pennies laid flat on the counter and her chin held level, and she had said plainly that she wished to purchase it. But what nobody had told her, and what the solicitor's soft, embarrassed cough would presently reveal, was that the deed folded so neatly into that small transaction did not name the cottage alone. It named a second house, a house shuttered and silent, standing in a lane she had never walked, in a corner of the parish nobody had thought to mention to her. A house whose ownership had been hidden for reasons that would take her the better part of a year to uncover, and which would in the end change everything she thought she had understood about who she was and to whom, in the quiet arithmetic of blood and memory, she had once belonged. If you will settle in with a cup of something warm, we would be glad to have you stay a while, for this is a slow story, and it earns its ending in its own time. There will be a solicitor with a nervous handkerchief and a stone-flagged kitchen full of dust and a locked door at the end of an ivy-choked lane and a letter that no living hand has touched in 30 years. There will be a woman who has learned, in her 5 years of walking from one lodging to the next, that value very often hides in the things that other people have already given up on. And there will be, at the last, a house that had been waiting for her without her knowing, and a name upon a paper she had never once heard spoken aloud in all her life. Do consider subscribing so you don't miss what unfolds in the chapters to come. And while you are here by the hearth with us, take a moment to say in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, because it is a real comfort, on evenings like this one, to know who is sitting quietly on the other side of the fire, whether it is raining outside your window, or the stars are out, or the wind is running low across a field you know by heart. Margaret had not always been a woman with only 2 pennies to her name. She had been born in the village of Foxton itself, in a stone-built house behind the churchyard, the only child of a country surgeon named William Foster and a schoolmaster's daughter, Anne Bright, who had married late and quietly loved each other well. Her mother had died of a low fever in the winter Margaret turned 9, leaving behind a cupboard of hand-labeled preserves, a copybook of household accounts written in her small, even hand, and a grandmother who came down from the North Country to keep the household together and would not leave again. That grandmother was Eliza Foster, 72 at the time of her arrival, twice widowed, mother of 3 children of whom only Margaret's father remained, and she was the person who taught Margaret nearly everything Margaret would later use to keep herself alive. Eliza had been housekeeper at a large rectory in the West Riding for 31 years before her first marriage, and she carried in her the whole quiet library of a working woman's knowledge: how to salt a joint, how to render lard, how to draw a fever with mustard and vinegar, how to sew a straight seam by lamplight, how to steep chamomile in feverfew and comfrey for the various sorrows of a body, and how to keep a set of household accounts so exact that the pennies balanced at year's end. She was a small woman, not 5 feet tall, with hands that were always warm and a voice that never rose. She did not praise Margaret in words. She would set a piece of muslin in the child's lap and watch her hem it. And then, if it was well done, she would say only, "That will do, child," and Margaret learned to hear those 4 words as a kind of blessing. When Margaret was 15, her father remarried, a widow from a neighboring parish named Harriet Belton, a woman of 38 with 2 grown sons of her own, and a careful, tight-lipped way of looking at the household ledgers Eliza kept. 2 years after the wedding, Margaret's father died suddenly of a chill contracted on a night call. leaving no proper will and only a small annuity that reverted at once to his widow. Eliza died the following spring at 80 in the chair by the kitchen fire where she had taken to napping in the long afternoons. She left Margaret a small black tin box, 4 inches by 6, its lid painted with a spray of forget-me-nots gone soft at the edges, and inside it a pair of steel scissors, a paper of pins, a folded lock of Margaret's mother's brown hair tied with a scrap of blue silk ribbon, and a note written in a hand Margaret already knew by heart. "For my Meg, who will make her way." On the morning of her 18th birthday, 3 weeks after Eliza's burial, Harriet called Margaret into the front parlor and explained, in the same tone she used with the butcher's boy, that the house was hers now and could no longer be expected to support a girl of no relation to her and no prospects to speak of, and that Margaret must find a place by the end of the month. She said it without cruelty and without warmth. Margaret did not argue. She packed the tin box, her mother's copybook, a change of linen, and her grandmother's gray shawl, and she walked out through the churchyard where her father and mother and grandmother lay side by side, and she did not look back. For 5 years afterward she lodged where she could. She worked a season as a nursery maid in a farmhouse 3 villages over, and then as a seamstress's apprentice in a market town, and then as a kitchen girl in a coaching inn, and then, when the inn closed, as a companion to an elderly widow who paid her in board and a shilling a week and died in her sleep at Christmas. She kept her mother's copybook wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her bundle and the little tin box in the pocket of her apron, where the weight of it against her hip had become, over the slow accumulation of 5 years, the closest thing she had to a hand held in hers. The morning Harriet Belton dismissed her, Margaret was already dressed and had been up since before 6, banking the kitchen fire and setting the kettle as she had done every morning of her life in that house. Harriet came down in her gray wrapper, poured herself tea, and asked Margaret to come into the front parlor when the tea was drunk. Margaret finished the washing up first. She dried her hands on the linen cloth by the sink, folded it over the rail, and went into the parlor, where Harriet sat in the good chair by the window with a small stack of papers on her lap, and a look on her face that suggested she had rehearsed what she meant to say and wished to have it over with. She spoke plainly. She said that with the annuity now hers and the house now hers, and with her own 2 sons soon to be settling their affairs, there was no reasonable provision by which a girl of 18, unrelated to her by blood, could be kept on. She said she had made inquiries in the neighboring parishes, and understood there were positions to be had for a girl who was clean and quiet, and could sew. She said she would give Margaret until the last day of the month, which was 3 weeks, and she would send her off with a written character. She said all of this without lifting her voice above the level she used to order coal. And when she had finished, she looked down at the papers on her lap and did not look up again. Margaret said, "Yes, ma'am." She said it because there was nothing else that answered the shape of what had been done. She left the parlor and went up the narrow back stair to the small room under the eaves that had been hers since she was a child, and she sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment with her hands folded in her lap, the way her grandmother had taught her to sit when she needed to think without moving. Then she stood up and began, quietly and methodically, to sort what belonged to her from what belonged to the house. It came, in the end, to very little. Her mother's copybook of household accounts, bound in brown cloth and rubbed soft at the corners. Her grandmother's gray shawl, folded into a square. The black tin box with the forget-me-nots on the lid. 2 shifts, 2 pairs of woolen stockings, 1 spare petticoat, 1 plain gray day dress, a brush and a comb, a needle case, a small square of soap wrapped in paper, and the pair of ankle boots she stood up in. She tied the linen into a bundle with a length of stout twine from the kitchen drawer, took her cloak from its peg by the back door, and left the character reference Harriet had written for her on the parlor table without opening it. She went out through the kitchen garden and around the side of the house and along the flagged path to the churchyard, where she stopped at the 3 stones that stood together beneath the yew. William Foster, surgeon of this parish, Anne, his wife, Eliza Foster, his mother. She did not weep. She stood there a while and let the cold settle into her fingers and read the 3 names as if they were a sentence spoken aloud, and then she turned and walked out through the lich gate and onto the lane, and by 10 o'clock she was 2 miles beyond the village and the day was still ahead of her. She had no place to go that afternoon, only the vague direction of a farmhouse the vicar's wife had mentioned in passing, 3 villages over, where a nursery maid was wanted. She walked because walking was what she could do, and because standing still just then was more than she could bear. The lane out of Foxton ran east between hedgerows of hawthorn and blackthorn that were bare in that late February light and threaded with old man's beard gone silver, and the ground under Margaret's boots was rutted from cartwheels and stiff with a crust of frost that broke under her heel and gave on to soft mud beneath. She walked with her bundle balanced against her hip and her cloak drawn close, and the wind came off the low fields in a steady flat pressure that made her eyes water and her ears ache, and after the first mile she stopped noticing it. The country there was ordinary country. Fields of winter wheat still low and gray-green, stubble fields turned dark by the plow, the occasional stand of ash or beech at a field corner, and now and again a farmhouse set back behind a ragged hedge with smoke rising thin and straight from its chimney into a sky the color of skimmed milk. She passed a boy driving 3 heifers along the verge, and he touched his cap and said, "Good morning, miss," and she said good morning and kept walking. She passed a woman at a cottage door beating a rag rug against the wall, and the woman looked at her and looked at the bundle and said nothing. She passed a milestone with the name of the next village cut into it, and the number 3, and she counted the miles left in her head against the light that was already at 11 in the morning, beginning its slow slide toward afternoon. By noon she had reached the first crossroads, and she sat down on the low wall beside the finger post and ate half of the bread she had wrapped in a cloth that morning from the pantry shelf, and she drank from the small stone trough where a pipe ran clear water from a spring, cupping it in her hand because she had no cup. Her feet had begun to ache in the way feet ache when boots have been made for standing rather than walking, and there was a hot place on her right heel that she knew would be a blister by nightfall, and she stood up anyway and shouldered the bundle and went on. The lane climbed a slow rise and dropped again into a hollow where a stream ran under a stone bridge, and she stopped on the bridge and looked down at the water, brown and clear over gravel, and watched a single dipper move along the bank with its small nervous bobbing, and she thought very clearly and without any drama that she was alone now and would have to think for herself about every single thing from this hour forward. It was not a frightening thought, it was only a true one, and she registered it the way her grandmother had taught her to register weather, as a condition to be dressed for. She walked on. By 4 o'clock she had come to the farmhouse the vicar's wife had named, and the farmer's wife opened the door and looked at her and said, "You're the girl from Foxton," and Margaret said, "Yes, ma'am," and the farmer's wife said, "Come in out of the cold," and Margaret stepped over the threshold and set her bundle down on the flagstones, and that was the first of the 5 years. 5 years later, on a mild gray afternoon in April, Margaret walked out of the solicitor's office in Foxton with the deed folded twice and pressed against the copybook inside her bundle, and she went first to the cottage she had bought for 2pence because it was the one she knew, and she stood in the lane before it and looked at it properly for the first time as her own. The cottage was built of the local gray stone, quarried within 3 miles of where it stood, and it measured perhaps 18 feet across the front and 22 deep, with a single chimney of red brick rising from the western gable and a roof of Cornish slate greened with moss and lichen and slipped in 2 places near the ridge. The front door was of oak, weather-blackened and swollen shut in its frame, with a wrought iron latch pitted with rust and a keyhole into which the solicitor's key turned only after Margaret had worked it patiently for a full minute with a little wet grit from the path. The door opened inward with a scrape and a groan, and the smell that came out was the smell of cold plaster, mouse, damp wool, and something faintly sweet that she later understood was the last apples of some long-dead autumn, rotted to dust on a shelf in the pantry. Inside there were 4 rooms and a scullery. The kitchen, which lay to the right of the door, had a wide open hearth blackened by decades of coal and wood. a cast-iron crane still fixed to the fireback, a stone-flagged floor uneven with settlement, and a deep window with leaded panes of which 7 were cracked and 2 were missing entirely, stuffed with rags gone to pulp. A pine table stood in the middle of the room with one leg propped on a broken brick, and along the far wall ran a dresser of soft yellow deal with 3 shelves and 2 drawers. The drawers stuck fast with damp, and the shelves holding a blue and white plate, a pewter mug green with verdigris, and a tin candlestick. To the left of the door was a small parlor with a smaller grate, a rag rug rotted through in the middle, a chair without a seat, and papered walls where the paper had peeled from the plaster in long curling tongues that showed the whitewash beneath. Behind the kitchen lay the scullery with its shallow stone sink, its pump handle rusted stiff, its copper for washing set into brick with the fire hole below choked by an old jackdaw's nest. Up the narrow boxed stair were 2 bedrooms under the slope of the roof, each with a small fireplace, each with a rope bedstead stripped of its mattress, each with a window looking one way at the lane and the other way at the tangled garden behind. The garden was 50 feet by 30, walled on 3 sides with the same gray stone as the cottage, and inside those walls the nettle stood waist-high, the briar had climbed and swallowed a bench, and the bindweed had drawn its pale trumpets over everything like a shroud. In the far corner, Margaret saw the shape of an apple tree, gone to moss and mistletoe but still living, and beside it the outline of what had once been a bed of herbs, marked by a low border of half-buried tiles. She stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and looked out at her own garden, and she did not smile, because that was not her way. But she set her bundle down on the pine table and untied the twine and lifted out the tin box and placed it on the dresser between the pewter mug and the tin candlestick, and she said aloud, quietly, "That will do." She did not sleep in the cottage that first night. She could not, because the chimney had not been swept, and the windows would not close, and the mattresses were gone, and the door itself could not yet be shut from the inside. She spent the night at the small inn near the churchyard, where the landlady, a Mrs. Penhaligon, gave her a truckle bed and a bowl of broth for 3 borrowed against her first week's work at the linen draper's, where the solicitor had spoken for her, and she rose before 6 and walked back to the cottage in the pale, wet morning and began. But before she began, she took the deed from the copybook and read it again by the light of the kitchen window, and she saw again what she had heard the day before, in the solicitor's voice, with its embarrassed cough, that the paper conveyed not only the cottage in this lane, called in the deed by no name at all, but a house, described as of 2 stories and a cellar, standing in a lane called Withy Lane on the northern edge of the parish, described as shuttered and unoccupied and known to the county surveyor as the property of one Alice Marchmont, spinster, deceased these 30 years, whose estate had been held in a chancery bundle undisturbed until an old clerk in Truro had noticed the entry and released it. By a mechanism the solicitor had described, but Margaret had not fully followed, to whomever should next purchase the cottage. She had purchased the cottage for 2d. She had, at the same instant and by the same paper, acquired the house of Alice Marchmont, whose name she had never heard. Margaret walked to Withy Lane that afternoon with the key the solicitor had given her, a long iron key with a hollow shaft and a ward at the end shaped like a clover, and the lane was as he had described, narrow between hedges of hazel and holly, ivy climbing the stone wall on the left side, and at its end, set back behind a broken iron gate, stood the house. It was larger than the cottage, 3 bays across and 2 stories tall, of the same gray stone but dressed at the corners with granite, and its windows were shuttered from the inside, every one, with weathered oak shutters gone to silver. The roof was of slate again, missing only a single tile at the near corner, and the chimneys, 4 of them, stood true against the sky. Ivy had climbed the eastern gable and had begun to pull at the guttering. The front door was of studded oak, painted once a dark green, now faded to gray-green, and its hinges were set into stone jambs. Margaret worked the key into the lock and turned it, and felt the wards move heavily and cleanly, and the door opened inward onto a stone-flagged hall smelling of cold and old paper and lavender. She stepped inside and stood a moment with her hand on the doorpost, because the house had the stillness of a room that has not been entered by a living person for a long time, and it took her a full breath to make herself walk on. The hall ran the depth of the house to a garden door at the back, and off it opened 4 rooms. A parlor to the right with furniture under Holland covers, a small dining room to the left with a table for 6 and 8 chairs stacked against the wall, a kitchen at the back with a range gone to rust but sound, and a small room beside the kitchen with a writing desk, a shelf of ledgers, and a chair with a needlework cushion faded to gray. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, each furnished, each with the bed made up under a linen sheet, each with a jug and basin on the washstand, the water in the jugs long since gone. Everything in the house had been left in order. The covers were straight. The ledgers were shelved by year. The bedding was folded. Someone had closed this house as one closes a book that will be reopened. And no one had reopened it for 30 years. Margaret went back down to the writing room off the kitchen and stood in front of the desk and looked at it for a long time before she touched it. The desk was of walnut, with a slanted lid and a small brass keyhole, and the key was in the keyhole. She turned it. The lid lifted on its hinges and folded down onto its supports, and inside there was a green baize writing surface, 4 small drawers along the back, and a row of pigeonholes above them, each holding papers tied with faded pink tape. Margaret took down the papers one bundle at a time and set them in order on the kitchen table, and she read through the afternoon, sitting on a wooden chair she had wiped with the corner of her apron, working through the papers of Alice Marchmont, spinster, of Withy Lane, born 1789, died 1843, at the age of 54. There were rent receipts, bills from the corn merchant, letters from a cousin in Bristol, a bundle of household accounts kept in a small, even hand very like her own mother's, and, in the last pigeonhole on the right, a sealed envelope addressed in the same small, even hand to whoever finds this. Margaret held the envelope in her lap for a moment, and then took it to the window for the light and broke the seal with her thumbnail. Inside were 2 things: a letter of 4 pages, folded in half, and wrapped in a square of oiled silk, a small cloth bag heavy in the hand. She set the bag on the sill and unfolded the letter and read it slowly, once through, and then a second time aloud in a low voice to the empty kitchen. The letter said, "My name is Alice Marchmont, and I have lived in this house for 31 years, having come to it in the spring of 1812 from the village of Foxton, where I was born and where my sister Anne was born after me. Anne married a young surgeon, William Bright, and died of a fever in her second confinement, and the child, a girl, did not live either, and after that I could not stay in Foxton, and I came here to Withy Lane, and I have kept this house alone. I have no living relations of my own blood. I write this in my 54th year, and I do not expect to see 55. In the bag with this letter are 42 sovereigns, which I have saved out of the rents of the 2 fields I own beyond the orchard, and I leave them, together with this house and its contents and the cottage at the other end of the parish which was my father's before me, to whoever comes here after me and finds this letter. I hope she is a young woman. I hope she has been in need. I hope she will keep the house warm." Margaret sat down in the chair by the desk with the letter in her lap, and did not move for a long time, because the surname Bright had been her mother's, and the village Foxton was her own, and the sister Anne who had died of a fever was not the Anne of her mother's line she had known of, but there had been, she remembered now, an older sister of her grandfather's called Anne, who had married a surgeon and died young, and Alice Marchmont had been that Anne's sister, and therefore Alice Marchmont had been her own great-great-aunt, and had left this house 30 years before Margaret was born, to whoever came. Margaret folded the letter along its old creases, set it inside the tin box on the kitchen table between the cottage and the house, and began the next morning at the cottage, because the cottage was smaller and could be made habitable first. She started with the chimney. She stood in the yard and looked up at the pot, then went to the village to Mr. Trewin, the sweep, aged 61, who came the same afternoon with his brushes and rods jointed in ash, ran them up through the flue in 5 lengths, and brought down half a bushel of soot and 1 dead jackdaw. He charged her 6pence and refused a 7th. She swept the hearth herself, laid a small fire of dry hazel and coal she had bought from the coal merchant Mr. Hollis, age 44, on credit against her first month at the linen draper's, and lit it that evening. The chimney drew. The windows, she did next. She took the leaded panes to Mr. Pascoe the glazier in the next village, walked the 4 miles with the sashes wrapped in sacking, and Mr. Pascoe, age 58, a widower with hands stained by lead, cut and set the 7 cracked panes and the 2 missing ones for 3 shillings and threw in the puttying without charge, because, he said, he had known a foster surgeon who had set his wife's wrist in 1839 and would not take money for the last quarter hour of work. Margaret walked the sashes home before dark. The door she planed herself. She had watched her father's man do it once, and she remembered the angle. She took the door off its pins, laid it across 2 trestles borrowed from Mr. Hollis, and worked the swollen lower edge down with a jack-plane lent by the carpenter Mr. Angove, age 39, until the door swung and shut clean against its stop. She rehung the latch, oiled the hinges with lamp oil, and by the second evening, the cottage door closed from the inside for the first time in 11 years. Inside, she scrubbed. She scrubbed the flagstones with soft soap and a stiff brush, twice, then a third time with vinegar and hot water. She scoured the copper in the scullery with sand and salt until the metal came up rose and clean. She freed the pump handle with lamp oil and slow turning and drew the first brown water, then the second, then the third, until the water came clear and cold. She whitewashed the parlor walls with a bucket of lime from Mr. Hollis and a broad brush lent by Mrs. Penhaligon at the inn, and the room brightened room by room as she worked. The garden she left until the cottage would keep her dry, then went at it in the second week with a scythe borrowed from a farmer's boy called Tom Rowe, age 17, who came on a Saturday, cut the nettles down to the root for her in an hour, and would take only a mug of tea and a slice of bread and dripping in payment. Margaret raked, burned the cuttings in a slow, smoky pile against the wall, and uncovered the bench, the tile border of the herb bed, and the flagged path that ran to the apple tree. Under the moss on the tree she found live wood and pruned it with the shears from the tin box, which had been her grandmother's, sharpened on a stone lent by Mr. Angove. The Withy Lane house she opened 1 room at a time. She kept the shutters closed on the front of the house at first and worked from the back, because the back rooms had a garden door and a scullery pump and could be lived from without announcing herself to the lane. She took the holland covers off the parlor furniture, folded them, brushed the horsehair sofa and 2 armchairs, and set them straight. She swept the flues in all 4 chimneys with Mr. Trewin, who came a second time and charged her 1 and 6pence for the 4. She scrubbed the range in the kitchen with sand and blacked it fresh with a tin of zebra polish bought for 4pence at the draper's. And by the 3rd day the range drew in heated water. She aired every mattress in the sun in the walled garden behind the house, 1 a day for 3 days, and beat them with a cane carpet beater found hanging in the scullery. Mr. Pascoe came without being sent for, walked around the outside of the Withy Lane house with his head tilted, and told her the eastern gable would want the ivy pulled off before winter, or the guttering would come with it. He came back on a Saturday with his son Ned, aged 19, and the 2 of them stripped the ivy in an afternoon and refixed the guttering with new iron brackets Ned had made at the smithy for the cost of the iron alone. Margaret gave them tea and a plate of bread and cheese in the kitchen and paid Mr. Pascoe 4 shillings, which he took after saying the price twice was 3. She kept the household accounts of both properties in her mother's copybook, in the pages her mother had left blank at the back, ruled in pencil into columns for date, item, from whom, and cost. She filed the deed in the walnut desk, in the pigeonhole where Alice Marchmont's letter had lain, and she filed with it the receipts from Mr. Trewin, Mr. Pascoe, Mr. Hollis, Mr. Angove, and the draper Mr. Bawden, age 52, who had given her 4 yards of unbleached calico and a pound of grey darning wool on account against her wages. She wrote to the county surveyor in Truro, in careful lettering with the pen from the desk, to confirm that the property had passed and to pay the small fee that the solicitor had said would settle the entry. The reply came within a fortnight in a stiff brown envelope. The entry was closed. The house and cottage were hers by deed of the 11th of April, and the fee of 7 shillings and 6pence was received with thanks. Margaret filed that letter with the others and closed the desk. By June, the cottage was clean, dry, and lived in, and the Withy Lane house was aired, swept, and open room by room, and Margaret had moved her tin box and her copybook and her grandmother's shawl to the small room off the kitchen at Withy Lane, and she slept there on a rope bed with a fresh mattress of clean wheat straw sewn into a ticking she had made from Mr. Bawden's calico. She kept the cottage as a second holding because it had been the first thing she had bought, and she would not let it stand empty. Word traveled through the parish quietly and by ordinary means. Mrs. Penhaligon at the inn told the carrier, who told the corn merchant, who told the vicar's wife, who called at Withy Lane on a Tuesday afternoon in July with a jar of gooseberry preserve and a lined notebook. The vicar's wife was Mrs. Bettinson, age 47, a small brisk woman in a black straw bonnet, and she sat in the parlor at Withy Lane on the horsehair sofa, drank her tea from the blue and white cup Margaret had brought over from the cottage dresser, and said that the parish had wondered about the house for 30 years, and now the house had a mistress, and would Margaret be willing to have her name entered on the parish list for the summer visiting rota? Margaret said she would. Mrs. Bettinson wrote the name Margaret Foster in the notebook and closed it and drank her tea. After that the callers came at reasonable intervals and for reasonable purposes. Mr. Bawden the draper walked out one Saturday to look at the fields beyond the orchard because he had leased them the last 5 years from an agent in Truro without knowing whose they were, and he sat with Margaret at the kitchen table and set out the terms plainly: £8 a year for the pair of fields, paid at Michaelmas and Lady Day, and if she would keep him on, he would send the first half at Michaelmas next. Margaret said she would keep him on, and Mr. Bawden wrote the agreement in his own hand on a half-sheet of foolscap, and both signed, and Margaret filed it in the walnut desk. That was her first rent. Mr. Angove the carpenter came in August with a second-hand pine table for the kitchen at Withy Lane because he had heard she was eating at the writing desk, and he would take for it the price of the wood and no more, 3 shillings and 9pence. Tom Rowe brought a basket of early apples in September from his father's orchard, and would not take money for them, but sat at the kitchen table and ate a slice of bread and honey, and told Margaret about the ploughing. Mrs. Penhaligon sent up a settle from the inn's back parlor that had been in her way for years, on a cart driven by her nephew, and Margaret paid Mrs. Penhaligon for the settle in kind by mending, over 3 winter evenings by lamplight, the whole of a set of 6 inn tablecloths with the darning wool from Mr. Bawden's shop. The linen draper's position Margaret kept through the summer, walking down to the shop in Foxton each weekday morning at 7:30 and back to Withy Lane in the evening, and she was paid 4 shillings a week and her keep in tea and bread at the shop's small counter. But by Michaelmas she had begun to take in plain sewing at home in the evenings, shirts for the farmers and pinafores for their girls, at a penny a seam, and by Christmas she gave notice at the draper's, kindly, and Mr. Bawden shook her hand and said he had expected it and wished her well. She took over Alice Marchmont's ledgers and kept them going in the same small, even hand, entering rents received, wages paid, coal bought, candles bought, tea bought, and repairs made. She hired in October a girl of 14 called Bessie Trethowan from a cottage a mile down the lane to come 3 mornings a week and help with the heavy scrubbing and the copper on wash days, and she paid Bessie 1 shilling and 9pence a week, and Bessie's mother came the first morning to see the house and went away satisfied. The vicar's wife entered Margaret on the parish rota for the winter visiting of the elderly and the sick, and Margaret walked out on Thursdays with a basket and a bottle of beef tea and a jar of honey, and sat in kitchens up and down the parish, and was known by name at every door within a mile by Christmas. She was called Miss Foster of Withy Lane by the older women, and Margaret by the younger, and neither surprised her. Mrs. Penhaligon at the inn called her Meg on Saturday nights when Margaret came in to settle the tablecloth bill and take her weekly pint of stout, and Meg was what her grandmother had called her, and Margaret answered to it and did not correct. On the first Sunday in Advent, Margaret walked to the parish church for the morning service, sat in a pew halfway down the north aisle, and after the service the vicar, Mr. Bettinson, age 51, shook her hand at the porch and said he was glad to see her among them. She walked home in the mild gray air along the lane with the hedges bare and the rooks calling over the ploughland, and unlocked her own door and put the kettle on the range in the kitchen at Withy Lane and sat down at the pine table Mr. Angove had made her and drank her tea. That was the shape her week had taken by then, and it held. On the eve of the new year, Margaret sat by the kitchen range at Withy Lane with the two small objects set out on the pine table before her. The black tin box with the forget-me-nots softened at the edges stood on the left, and beside it, wrapped in its square of oiled silk, the cloth bag Alice Marchmont had left with the letter. Margaret had opened neither that evening. She had only set them side by side, and looked at them by the light of one candle and the red bed of the fire. Two women, one dead 30 years and one dead 5, who had never met, had each set aside for her what they could. Her grandmother Eliza Foster had left her scissors and pins and a lock of her mother's hair and the words "For my Meg, who will make her way." Alice Marchmont had left her 42 sovereigns, a house of 2 stories, a cottage in another lane, and the words, "I hope she is a young woman. I hope she has been in need. I hope she will keep the house warm." Margaret had made her way, and she had been in need, and she was keeping the house warm. Harriet Belton was 2 parishes away and had not been thought of in months. The tin box would go back to its shelf in the writing room in the morning, and the cloth bag to the drawer of the walnut desk, and Margaret would go on. She was 23 and homeless no longer. She had paid 2pence for a cottage and had been given a house, and it was the best 2pence she ever spent. If this story has stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who has ever been told there was no place for them. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight, and what small thing, given to you by someone who loved you, you have kept safe through the hardest years. What have you built, quietly, from what others left behind?